Welcome to the series Person of Interest, brought to you by the Australian Investigation Agency, fighting for truth, accountability and justice. My name is John Armfield. Welcome to Episode 7, Part 3, Failure to Act When Warned. This is the final chapter in the Commander Fiona Southwood files. This episode is not about grief, it is not about anger, it is not about personality. It is about process. It is about what happens when a member raises legally advised allegations through their chain of command and how that chain of command responds. I will show you Defence's own standards. I will show you Defence's own documents and evidence. And I will ask you to measure the two. Section 1, the warning. On legal advice, I formalised allegations through my chain of command, Commander Fiona Southwood. I raised privacy breaches, maladministration, false timelines, policy failures, duty of care breaches. This was not a social media post. This was not a rumour. This was documented inside Defence and primarily through a record of conversation. That moment matters because from that date forward, the ADF, the Defence Force, was on notice. When an institution is on notice of very serious defects, it has a duty to preserve the evidence, investigate independently, protect the complainant from reprisal, and apply complaint handling principles. But instead, something else happened. They decided to not investigate the complainant and report them to the Joint Military Police Unit, and then they refused to present the findings for over 9 months. Section 2, the gatekeeper. Commander Fiona Southwood described my complaint as wide-sweeping and lacking detail. Yet the email traffic shows she immediately alerted the subject side of the complaint before clarifying it with me. If a complaint lacks detail, the correct leadership response is clarification. Instead, the first movement was sideways. Information moved without my voice attached to it. And that is why I refer to Commander Fiona Southwood as the gatekeeper. Because the control of the flow of information is what determines an outcome. Section 3, the fact find that failed. Commander Fiona Southwood reported my complaint of maladministration that had been advised by the Royal Commissioner himself, Nick Caldis, regarding Defence Force recruiting directly to Defence Force recruiting. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Freeman was chosen to initiate a fact find. The selected fact finding officer was chosen because he had earlier oversight of my matter. Yet, the Good Administrative Decision-Making Manual states, a fact-find officer should not have been personally involved in a matter being looked into. But Commander Fiona Southwood chose him precisely because he had been. Inspector General ADF later recorded, no parties were interviewed, the fact-find was largely a desktop assessment, that Freeman relied on contemporaneous notes prepared for earlier reporting, that Freeman went beyond its terms of reference, and that Freeman made conclusions about my mental health. But most importantly, they identified that Freeman had not undertaken the fact-find course. He was unqualified. They also identified the process was materially flawed, and it could be reasonably open to an apprehension of bias. Yet, Commander Fiona Southwood told Inspector General ADF that she had complied with the complaint handling principles. But Inspector General ADF had found the process was materially flawed. These two positions cannot both be correct. That is not rhetoric, that is logic. That should have been procedural fairness. Section 4, the mental health pivot. The flawed response reframed my complaint through the lens of mental health. It referenced my psychological support history, And my mental health history was introduced into the response in a way later described by senior Navy leadership, both Chief of Navy Mark Hammond and Captain Ian Andrews, representing Deputy Chief of Navy, as unacceptable. Yet Commander Fiona Southwood still delivered that official response from Freeman. And she delivered it on the same day she provided me my medical discharge. Additionally, emails attributed to Southwood describe me as triggered at an all-female event. In case you were wondering, I have always identified as male. Another comment described a statement of mine as technically not true. I offered Fiona the chance to investigate that as well, to which she refused. All these comments were also redacted under freedom of information. They were restored only after I complained and made a submission to Freedom of Information Review. This matters because if mental health support becomes a credibility weapon, it is weaponized, the message to serving members is chilling. Seek help and risk later characterization and termination. This is not a cultural strength. That is not adhering to service values. That is deterrence and protecting the risk to reputation of the organisation. Section 5, the Freedom of Information and Document Control. Through Freedom of Information processes, I identified redacted commentary and inconsistent timelines, internal language, and that was not provided voluntarily. All language was subjective, degrading, derogatory, with no right to reply. Why? Because the ADF never expected me to investigate and identify their comments and the narrative. Transparency came after my appeal, not before, and this sequence matters. They redacted, they reviewed, they released. But why? In the case above, it was a Navy commander who reached out to me anonymously to identify that naval officers were choosing what they wanted redacted. He advised they would not do it at Freedom of Information Review because the next step in the complaints process is the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, OAC. If they had redacted that information a second time, it is a breach of legislation and a criminal offence. I ask, is this a values-based organisation? Are these people worthy of leadership and taxpayer-funded salaries? Section 6, the Decisive Act. There is one sentence that captures the outcome. Whilst I appreciate the member's contribution to defence and his prolonged high performance and dedication to service as a clearance diver, at this time and considering all the information I am privy to, I do not support ongoing retention. That sentence does not address the evidence, but it does resolve the problem. How? By removing the person raising it, me. And I need to say something clearly. In later episodes, I will examine whistleblower protections, because at that moment, in substance, I had become a whistleblower. I raised evidence of misconduct, and all complaints were on the legal advice of an ADF lawyer. I raised these complaints through my chain of command, Commander Fiona Southwood, and as the ADF lawyer stated, I then faced criminal prosecution, and my family and I became the victims. Instead of protection, termination followed. Section 7, Method and Motive. Let's examine the pattern. Method. The complaint's raised. The complaint is redirected. The fact finder selected who had prior involvement. No interviews conducted. It was desktop reliance on disputed notes. My mental health narrative is introduced. They provide false information and statements that Navy was unaware of my mental health support, which I can prove is false. The compliance is asserted. My career termination followed, and that is the sequence. Now for the motive. It was institutional, not personal. If the ADF acknowledged any of my complaints, if they acknowledged the mandatory policy breaches, then civil liability exposure increases, command accountability risk increases, and most importantly to the ADF, reputational risk increases. Where exposure to liability and reputational risk intersect, the institution becomes structurally risk adverse. That does not prove intent, but it does explain the organisation's decision and pathways. Now, this is not an allegation of crime. This is an observed governance risk pattern. Section 8, Integrity and Risk Indicators. Using publicly recognised public sector integrity risk indicators, we must consider the conflict of interest risk, procedural fairness failure, selective evidence reliance, adverse action after disclosure, such as a whistleblower reprisal, suppression or delayed disclosure of evidence, and institutional narrative preservation. These indicators are present in documented form and are presented in the following evidence matrix. Whether they meet a criminal threshold, such as breaching the Australian privacy principles legislation or perverting the course of justice, is for independent authorities to investigate on conclusion of the Inspector General ADF investigation, which is ongoing. But indicators do not require conviction to exist. Section 9, the Oversight Optics. Commander Fiona Southwood now serves as Deputy Director of Inquiries within Inspector General ADF Office. I currently have matters under Inspector General ADF review relating to my management, specifically under the chain of Commander Fiona Southwood, and my brother's death. I am unsure how she was posted into a Deputy Director Inquiry Officer IGADF role. The Inspector General ADF Assessments Report highlights her failures in adherence to the Complaints and Resolution Manual. Southwood initiated, reviewed, and provided me the findings of an investigation that Inspector General ADF stated was flawed, biased, exceeding terms of reference, and an investigation that was conducted by an unqualified individual who lied about the Navy not being aware of my mental health support. Southwood provided me the Freeman document that was false, and now she is posted to this role while an investigation pertaining to her is ongoing. This organisational protection and what appears as organisational corruption is confronting and shocks me the ADF are being so openly unprofessional. Oversight must not only be independent, it must be seen to be independent. This is a governance, ethics and integrity issue. But how? We just had a Royal Commission. The Australian taxpayer deserves and should demand better. Section 10, the Values Test. The Navy I enlisted in had values: honour, honesty, courage, integrity and loyalty. It had signature behaviours: people first, performance, professionalism. The question is not whether the ADF values exist. The question is whether they were applied. Here is Defence's own standard. Here is the evidence. I've provided it. Australia, I need you to measure it. The evidence matrix. There is one final point that matters. The evidence you have seen in this episode was not created for YouTube or Facebook. The evidence was provided to a Royal Commission, a statutory inquiry established under Commonwealth law. While a Royal Commission is not a criminal court, evidence given under oath does carry a legal weight. The Royal Commission was legally obliged to provide the Commonwealth all of my evidence prior to my testimony. The Commonwealth declined to challenge my evidence through cross-examination. The only intervention, and the only late intervention sought by the Commonwealth, was the redaction of the names, the ranks, and the positions of the officers involved. And that occurred after business hours, the night before I gave evidence. This is how low our ADF senior leadership has sunk. ADF leadership, with all their power and superiority, refused to stand, to fight, and to defend themselves against an enlisted sailor. Australia, that is a massive red flag. The Royal Commission seeded names late that night, and that matters because this is not a narrative built in isolation. This is a documented record tested in a national legal forum. The evidence matrix on your screen, it identifies each document relied upon as evidence across all 3 series of episode 7. Every assertion and every allegation that I've made here is anchored to primary documentation. I'm not asking you to believe me. I am fallible, but I am asking you to examine the record. My arguments and statements are still yet to be discredited. The ADF, the Commonwealth, and the officers involved refused to defend their correspondence, their actions, or their reputations. Their only response was to redact and hide the names and identity. Are these the actions of our military leaders? Australia, do you truly feel safe with these individuals responsible for the defence of our nation? In closing, I've served over 30 years as a volunteer lifesaver. I've served over 20 years as a Navy clearance diver. I've never flinched in a rescue, and I've never flinched or not gone on an operation or deployment. So I ask Australians one question. Do you want leaders who confront the uncomfortable truth? Or do you want leaders who close the doors on it? I am one sailor. I do not have an institution behind me. But I will proudly die defending our nation, our flag, and our values. And I think the evidence is there. But do you see this in the military leaders, the officers, and those that I have named? What I have is documentation. What I have is evidence. Please share it, and please ask questions. If you want change in society, government, or the Australian Defence Force, it starts with you. I've proven the fight for you, but do you see value in me? In the common man, in the little man. In episode 8, we leave the base, we move to ministerial awareness, because when internal safeguards fail, democracy is all that remains. Thank you for your support. Thank you, Australia. Thank you.
Someone told me long